All right, well, we are going to get started. I can't talk today. It is the top of the hour. So as folks continue to join, hello from everybody. Everybody out there, we are very excited to have you on today, and we are very excited to talk about our topic today, I guess we could say. So today we have the opportunity. I don't know why I'm so tongue-tied today. It's been one of those days, guys. But we are excited to have Sam Clements join us. So Sam will introduce you here in a minute, but today we are going to talk about AP-on-a-Stick surveys. Why and why not we should do them. So I'm going to actually turn the time over to Sam and just let him introduce himself. You guys all know me. We've got Stu and then Grant, of course, joining us from Australia. But Sam, for those who don't know you, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little about you?
Hi everybody, my name is Sam Clements. I'm an engineering director out of the Office of the CTO for Mobility at Presidio. We're a VAR here in the States, and the title is a mouthful, so apologize for that. But CCIE, wireless, CWNE, ECHO instructor, and do a handful of other things in the Wi-Fi industry, so generally passionate about it. And, we have a pretty large team, and so like to think that I can represent them well.
We like to think that too, but we'll tell you after the webinar how that goes, right?
That's fair.
And we're going to do a Presidio survey, right? Afterwards? Is that?
Yeah.
Hold up scorecards at the end out of 10.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
We passed out numbers to the audience while you weren't looking. Yeah.
But yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
All right. So today, AP on a stick, how important is it? So Grant, why don't you talk to us a little about network lifecycle and understanding how AP on a stick fits into that process?
Yeah, thanks, Tawny. I mean, that's probably a good way to set the scene as well. That you know, if we sort of take a step back and look at that network lifecycle and what that means for AP on a stick. And so, you know, typically we would work this in as a, you know, there would be a start of the lifecycle with the design process. And so, you know, you've got to have the right tools for that. So we've got ECHO Pro to do the design. We've got the validation process, which would typically follow. So we're going to come in and we're going to do a site survey, you know, with the ECHO tool set. We've got the management part of the life cycle. And, you know, then maybe at a later stage, we would have to, you know, do some troubleshooting and things like that, because, you know, the network performance, it's going to, you know, degrade over time as well. So this is also, it's a cyclical process as well. So this is something that, you know, is always evolving. It's always, you know, sort of something that needs to keep getting updated and upkeep. But Sam, we were having a bit of a pre-webinar chat about this the other day, and we were sort of talking about where AP on a stick fits in that network life cycle, and you had some pretty good insight there. So you were sort of saying, you know, that you would see it as a bit of an offshoot in the design phase, isn't it?
Yeah, I do. You know, this traditional life cycle circle that we see is just sort of well ingrained in everybody's mind. I see, you know, AP on a stick obviously landing in the design piece of it, but where it lands in the design piece, I think, depends a lot on who you are and what you're doing, how you're designing, and a variety of things. And it can fit sort of in a lot of different places in design. Generally speaking, though, I think that we all see design as being, where the heck is your AP going to go, right? Picking those locations. And there's obviously a million and one ways to do that. And when I look at AP on a stick, I look at it as being a sort of a circular reinforcement of our predictive design efforts. Of course, obviously depending on the scenario, but I think that as I move through the design component of the network lifecycle image that we see here, for the most bang for the buck from my perspective is to look at design as being sort of that predictive design. You get your floor plan, you draw your walls, you sort of estimate what the environment's going to look like, and then in those environments where it's relevant to go and stage that AP where you predicted it's going to go and match that AP on a stick design, that empirical measurement, with what you predicted. And if it matches, then you have a pretty good level of confidence that your predictive design was spot on. If it doesn't match, then you have a pretty good level of confidence your predictive design was not spot on. And so then there's that decision tree about what do you do then. And I think that's sort of where you dive off into the weeds as far as the minutia of the conversation is concerned. But, you know, there are a lot of people who do You know, I've heard people go, well, I'm just going to go and I'm not even going to do a predictive design. I'm going to do an AP on a stick to start. And I'm just going to survey one cell. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to modify my predictive design to look like my one AP on a stick. And then I'm going to assume that that means that the rest of my predictive design is good. You know, regardless of sort of where it fits in the design component, I think sort of nailing down that it is indeed sort of one of those design pieces that sits squarely in that empirical measurement piece is really the point of what I would consider to be the most important.
So, Sam, in your definition, in your terms, what is an AP on a stick survey? Like, you know, it's funny, just side note, I was sharing this with someone and somebody asked me, Tommy, why would you say that? APoS. I was like, oh, that is not it's not what you think. So Sam, what that is.
Yeah, and you know, it's been called a lot of different things by a lot of different people, and I think at the end of the day, what it is it's staging an AP where you think it's going to go, and then measuring what that AP's coverage looks like. And sort of the industry has just coined it AP on a stick because you get a stick and you put the AP on the top and you hold it in place, you know, after a fashion, and you walk around it, right? And that could be, you know, telescopic pole or whatever, man. There's people, you know, there's plenty of people who do AP on a stick without a stick, right? I've seen them done on scissorless. I've seen people move ceiling tiles and just put the whole thing on top and hang the antenna below. Those all I think still qualify as AP on a stick efforts because they're sort of the pre-design empirical measurement of where and how your cell is going to perform before you actually run a network cable and do the physical install. It just so happens that the industry has adopted the term AP on a stick. I mean, I guess there's the Jeff Dunham, the jalapeno on a stick reference. Like maybe, I don't know, maybe that plays into it, maybe it doesn't. But yeah. You know, there's a hot dog on a stick. There's plenty of things on a stick, right?
I guess the core thing we want to emphasize is that it is a temporary, like you said, it's a staging environment, so it's temporary. So no matter how it's mounted, it is a temporary, you know, type of installation. So the scissor lift example, you know, I've seen warehousing, right, where, you know, it's 10, 15 meters up in the air and literally the access point is attached temporarily with zip ties, right? So it doesn't look that pretty, but it's enough to get the job done. Let's understand what the cell coverage looks like. You know, validate that area, and you know, maybe it's a rinse and repeat type of scenario, right?
Okay, so question
for
Grant and for Sam, I'm going to pose it to each of you. So if you have a complex environment, how do you go about, like if you're not sure, so you've got your predictive design, you think it's how it is, what do you do if you're not sure about walls or what the attenuation measurement is going to be of those walls, or even what the material is? How would you go about that in your getting that prepped for your diagnostic survey?
Well, so the approach that I've taken is that there's always some sort of baseline design that's been done. So a predictive design would be done. So I've at least got an idea of, you know, a rough estimate of, you know, what type of cell I might be using, what type of external antenna I might be using, but I don't know how correct or incorrect that initial design might be because, you know, the environment is probably going to be quite challenging. Maybe we don't know what the wall materials are going to be made out of. And so at least with that base predictive, I've got an idea of where I can start, where I can initially position my temporary access points, and what AP models I might need to bring to the site, you know, what antenna variants I might need to use, and work from there. Sam, what do you?
Yeah, you know, you get really philosophical really quickly about when and where and how and what you consider validation and what you consider design. I've heard plenty of folks say, you know, it doesn't matter what you do or how you do your design. The most important piece is validation, and sort of whether you believe that or not, I think that this is probably one of the most important topics of the entire conversation, which is if your network is important enough, you should be validating that design. And I look at AP on a stick as validating the design before it goes in. And you can validate a design after it goes in. You can do an AP on a stick and then validate after the AP on a stick or after the design has gone in. At the end of the day, it's about incurring risk, and it's proactively answering the question about what if, when I get ready to go validate my network, it doesn't perform the way I think it should. We all know that there is such a thing as too many APs, and there's plenty of ways to validate your network. And frankly, if you're not validating your network, your users are validating your network. And if you're relying on your users to validate your network, I guess, again, really philosophically speaking, I would say that's probably a bad idea. But you don't want to have that validation occur after you hang your APs and then realize you have to go move a bunch of things after the fact. And I think that the concept of validation is really what we're after here. And I look at AP on a stick as sort of a pre-installation validation, or a measure twice, cut once type of a scenario, where you're saying, I have an extremely high degree of confidence that when this AP goes in this location, it's going to perform the way I expect it to when I come back to validate it after the fact. And I would say, everybody needs to be validating in some way, shape, or form. Some people validate AP on a stick, some people validate after installation, some people do both. Some people do neither and wait for their users to do it. But your network is being validated, whether you want it to or not. You probably want to validate it so that you know proactively what that network is going to look like. And I would warrant, if your network's important enough, you probably want that network validated before you have your cable vendor or whomever go and hang APs and run drops. I've had several organizations who have come to me and said, hey, we did a predictive design, and then we were going to go do our design. We're going to go do the implementation based off the design. And then we validated one AP in our design, and the one AP looked nothing like any of the other APs that I predicted out. And because I validated that one AP, it turned out that I needed almost double the number of APs that I thought that I was going to have. And they were going to go do this design. They were going to go do the implementation based off of predictive design. And the guys probably would have lost their jobs had they done their deployment and then gone back after the fact and said, okay, let's go ahead and validate this, realized there was a bunch of holes, and they had to go and double up the deployment after the fact. It's a safety net from my perspective. You have no real way of knowing how your antennas are going to look, or whether the antenna manufacturer sent the correct patterns to Ekahau to do the predictive modeling on, or any of those things. And so it's a check and balance, or it's a check, right, for what you expect the users to experience after the fact.
Gotcha. So have you ever had something like interference, like plants that you didn't realize were there, that they had large trees in an atrium that were not on any plans? Have you ever had anything like that impact your design?
Yeah, I would say all the time. I would say that once the aesthetic police gets a hold of a facility, after it's been there for a year or whatever, and they start, moving things around, plants and atriums are a really good idea, or a really good thing to move into a facility to give it a refreshed or a spruced up look, or whatever. And there are plenty of, heck, there's people who, blow out walls, or people who, put in water fountains, people who change what that design looks like after the fact, prior to you doing your design. Heck, there are architects who put a blueprint of a building in, and as they're building the building, they're making changes, and you may not have the most current floor plans of a building that's even being constructed right in front of you. Those buildings change as much as they don't want to admit it. They change all the time, and those changes impact RF. Right? That's just the brutal truth of it.
Yeah, there was an example that I came across a couple of years ago. There was some on-site survey work needed to be done. The initial design, where the access point was placed in what looked to be just an office room, it turned out that it was a hospital, so it was a hospital environment, and it was actually a compactus was being built right underneath the access point. So if you don't know what a compactus is, it's basically a big bunch of metal shelving that holds patient records, and it can slide back and forth and things like that. So basically a big metal cube was going to be positioned directly under the access point, with probably about, like a thumb space worth of, of gap between the access point and the compactus. And so upon seeing that, that the access point simply just had to be moved. But the guys that were installing the compactors, they had no idea, and it was only because we were on site that we actually picked that kind of thing up. So that validation piece is absolute.
So someone
Look,
has a question before Sam. Oh, I'll let you respond before I jump into that.
Oh, I was going to wax philosophically about wired networks for a second, which is we don't let our wired cable plant go in without a validation, without a layer 1 or layer 2 validation of what those cables look like either. Nobody's going to build a building and then let their cable installer go in and run the cables and then say, okay, cool, you're good to go. I see there's a bunch of drops. No, we expect our cable installers to give us a report back that says, hey, at layer 1, we've tested all your cables. Well, as it turns out that we all implicitly we set an expectation, we test our cables at layer 2 as well. We just don't know we do it. Our layer 2 test from a design perspective is, have we exceeded 100 meters, right? The layer 2 at Ethernet, the boundary is 100 meters, and we all know this. And so we test every single cable within the confines of what we expect it should be. We get a layer 1 test from the cable, we get a layer 2 test, we get a report that says, hey, it's under 100 meters, we're good to go. Right? We do the same thing when we're doing validating networks with an AP on a stick. Your layer 1 test is your spectrum analysis. Your layer 2 test, which is how long your cable run is in the Ethernet world, is mandated by a variety of things in the Wi-Fi world. All we're doing is we're just doing a cable test for a cable that doesn't exist. And you would not do a cable test for your new network run. Why would you not do a cable test for your AP that's providing that layer 1, layer 2 access for your clients?
Yeah, fair point.
Yeah, great point. So someone had a question for you guys, and I'm just going to read it to you. What is a good rule of thumb for the number of APs to survey on a stick? For example, if I have an office where walls and overall building layout is the same, isn't the data valid for the rest of the facility, assuming that the walls and construction are the same? Why are you laughing?
Key word might be assuming, right? Like we are like, and that's the tricky part. You're assuming that the rest of the walls, the rest of the construction is the same. I mean, we might be able to expand a little bit on that when we get to the use cases, but maybe with a modern build, something that's got a lot of repetition, like maybe a hotel, that might be the case. But with some other type of facilities, that may not be the case. So it's probably going to be site specific, I would say. What about you, Sam? What do you think?
Yeah, is this where I say it depends, or is that later on?
I was almost going to say it, but I didn't want to rob you on that.
You've already waxed philosophical.
Right. Yeah.
You may need Superman vision for that, right? So.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I've been into many facilities that were repurposed over the years where they go, well, yeah, there was a chiropractor in here 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, when chiropractors did x-rays, they put lead in the walls. And so what looks like a typical office building out of a strip mall, you run into that one room that has lead walls buried in it because the new tenant came in and just painted over them, and they certainly didn't pull the lead out of the walls. I mean, that's a very, very common example of you have no idea what the people who were before you in that facility did, just like the people that are going to come after you have no idea what you did in the facility. If you can guarantee that what's in the walls in another location that you haven't measured match what's in the walls of an area of a location that you have measured, then sort of good to go. The reality is I don't think any of us can guarantee without opening up the wall.
Yeah. So you're saying we can't assume?
I would say that I would be uncomfortable assuming. Now, I don't know everybody's skills everywhere, right? If if you're proficient in construction and you can read floor plans, and if you do know that you were the only tenant in the building, and you do know that there are no pipes in the wall, and there's no electrical, and nobody had to do a run for an AV system on the floor above and used your wall as a chase, or if you can guarantee those things, then one drywall in one section of a building probably looks like one drywall in another section of a building. Most people can't guarantee that, though.
So talking about, we've talked a lot about apianistic surveys, what they are. When do you do them? So if you have a location that has a, or you're doing a design for a company that has 1,000 locations, you survey every single location, right? That's how this works?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I was watching the webinar you guys did was it 2 weeks ago with Jason, where he talked about putting the APs. There was the big picture of the power plant, and there was an AP up in the corner, and he said something like it was how many thousands of dollars it took just to get electricity at the location where the AP was going to go. Clearly, you want to stage an AP there, and you want to walk around it, you want to measure it before it goes in. That's sort of one of those chip shots, right? That's one of those well duh scenarios. There's a whole lot of other scenarios, though, that sort of back off of that stringent requirement. And without saying it depends again, the general guidance that I use is that there tends to be a good boundary that most people can measure. And that boundary is cost of installation, because it's about balancing risk. And if the cost of installation exceeds the cost of the AP, in my book, that demonstrates more risk than I'm willing to incur from a design, from a person who owns the design. And that's of course a highly variable conversation. You look at a new AP from, do we say vendor C? Is that how we refer to them? The AP has a list price of $2,000 and the external antenna has a list price of $2,200. And so the list price for the AP is like $4,300. And then you go, okay, great. What's the cost of installation for that AP? Well, so I'm going into a mental health facility that has anti-ligature requirements. I have a hard deck ceiling. I have an enclosure. I have asbestos in the wall. I have to deal with closing down a hospital wing. I have to deal with union labor. I have to deal with, cost of the cable, cost of the switch port. If you can distill the rest of your deployment down and all the services associated with that deployment, and the cost to run that AP minus the cost of the AP is greater than the cost of the AP, then in my book, it becomes that really, really easy conversation about insurance. And really, that's all AP on a stick is it's insurance to make sure that when that goes in, you've got a pretty good idea that it's going to perform the way it should.
So Stu, I'm going to pose this question to you. So that picture that we showed previously was an AP, like a survey you had done, correct?
That would be correct, yes.
So what is a good rule of thumb for the number of APs to survey on a stick? What should you have in your kit? What should what equipment do you need to make sure that you have with you? So like, for example, if you have an office where there's walls, building layout is the same, do you need multiple APs to stage? What is typical?
Well, there are different use cases for sure. The depends does come into play, knowing your environment that you're going to. So what I'd like to do is make sure that if I am going to go and do an AP on a stick survey, I'm going to carry at least 2 access points with me. And the reason I do that is because I want to have a backup if I'm going out to a specific location. Maybe I'm traveling. If I'm setting up one particular area, I've got my kit, I got my stand pole. I've also got my battery backup, right? And I've also got external antennas, because sometimes you just don't know, right? Sometimes you may know, okay, you know what, I might need to go with an internal AP, but also bring an external. And as you can see up behind me there is use so you can use a dipole antenna or have the monopole antenna, which I'm showing on the camera now, because you never know what type of environment may require a different way of thinking and understanding how the complexities of RF, because and there's one thing that I learned early on, and gaining knowledge from maybe Sam as well, is that, it's and Jake as well, is try a different antenna, right? Because even though that may look like a location that you could get away with an Omni, the areas around you, like as Grant said, you can have those shelvings in the middle of the way, and that you may need something better to down tilt that. And so there's bring multiple antennas, whether it's a patch antenna, a little bit more power, and try different things. So try to build your kit in a way that knowing where you're going is one. Making sure you got the right battery backup, whether it's the Ventiv or Exceltex, and different types of antennas that you might want to use. And of course, making sure you got the right AP that the customer is going to be using, right? Because you want to be testing with the right, with the AP that you're going to deploy, right, to get the best understanding of what's going on.
So speaking
sorry, just you said that you mentioned the battery a couple of times, Stu, and I mean that can't be emphasized enough. There was an example of a customer I was speaking to, and they didn't have a battery pack, and they were doing an AP on a stick, and every time they had to shift that access point, and they didn't have enough cable run for the PoE, they had to unplug it, move it, then plug it back in, wait for it to boot, and over a couple of days, that time just adds up, and that's the last thing you want to
Absolutely.
be doing.
And not to product placement, but a battery such as this, that's got heavy duty requirements, will power your Cisco 3802 style or 9130 style APs, because they require a lot of power. And you want to make sure, as what's often known as, and Sam, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if delivering the right amount of power to an AP is important, because if you don't, it can inadvertently disable antennas that you might want to use in your survey. Is that still the case now, or has that been changed? Or?
Yeah, that's 100% correct, and it depends on what you're measuring, right? So that insurance comes in a variety of ways. It's not just you could be measuring that layer 2 performance, right, that we talked about before. You could be doing iPerf performance, right? All of those things are valid when you're talking about doing an AP on a stick. And if your application requires you to go out and empirically measure that you're going to get gigabit Wi-Fi or 500 megabits per second throughput or whatever, and you are doing that in a battery-powered scenario where a battery has not provided enough power to turn up all of the radio chains, then you absolutely could be measuring data that is incorrect, and you could be making decisions based on bad data. Yeah, no doubt about it.
In an effort just to make sure that we have enough time, because I know a lot of questions are coming in, so folks, we're doing our best to get to those. One of the things that I do think is important for us to highlight is, especially Stu, you had talked about shelving, Grant, you had talked about shelving. When you're doing a design for a warehouse, you need to look at the environment. Is it cyclical? Is there constantly inventory in there? What is the performance of the network, full capacity with inventory in there? Or is it, during off season, it has less inventory, but still different requirements. So that's one of the other things that you need to make sure you're taking into account, the time of year in that survey, for facilities like that do have a cyclical life cycle in inventory, right? So there's a lot of questions coming about specific use cases. So let's talk about a few here. I know that a lot of folks have a lot of questions. So speaking of warehousing, Sam, why don't you, I know you've had a lot of experience doing some of those things, so why don't you share some of your AP on a stick tips and experience surveying in those environments?
Yeah, so warehouse environments are going to look a lot like the environments that Jason and George talked about a couple weeks ago, which is one of those environments where you have to take an extra amount of care, not just from an RF design perspective, but from a life and linen safety perspective. In that many times there are forklifts zipping all over the place. Many times there are pallets or lifts that you're going to have to deal with. There's dangers in a warehouse that don't necessarily exist in your typical carpeted office environment. The mechanisms are the same, meaning you're staging an AP where you expect it to go, and you're measuring what that AP's coverage looks like. But how you get an AP to a ceiling obviously isn't the same as sort of what you would do in a carpeted office environment. You say, well, I've got to get an AP in the ceiling, and you walk into an area and you look up and then the ceiling is 30 feet above you. How do you get up there? There's everything from, lifts to, are you aerial work platform certified to operate a lift? If not, then you have to get somebody to come and work the lift for you. I've been in warehouses before where there are no aerial work platforms, there are no certifications required, but they have tons of forklifts. And so I've literally had to do AP on a sticks where you take a pallet, and you go to your local hardware store and get a bucket filled with ballast, and you put a PVC rod in it, and you strap the AP to the PVC rod, and you get a forklift driver to come pick the whole thing up and run it up 30 feet in the air, and then you say, cool, stop right there. I'll be back in a half an hour. And you go walk around that AP, and it becomes a 2-man job or a 3-man job sometimes. I would say that in those environments, it becomes really, really critical to understand how that RF looks, because when you talk about providing RF coverage at that 1 meter off the ground mark, or you're going to hold the device, or maybe 1.5 meters where the forklift computer is or whatever, you really want to make sure that that AP is going to be up where it is so that you understand what the resulting RF is going to be like on the ground, whether you're pointing a patch at the ground or you're using a low gain Omni or a high gain Omni, depending on your application. The fact that you're measuring it, I think, is probably the thing that's going to be most telling. The cool thing about warehouses is because you're so far away from the AP, you can see effects that you would not necessarily otherwise be able to see that maybe show up on, for example, an antenna radiation pattern, where it's that donut looking, Omni circle coverage pattern from a low gain Omni. If you take a low gain Omni and you put it 30 feet up in the air, you can actually visualize that as you walk down an aisle. If the AP is in the middle of the aisle, you can see the signal strength fall off as you get underneath the AP, and then as you walk past the AP, you can see it pick back up as you walk in underneath that cone of silence, is what they would call it, underneath the AP. Something you wouldn't typically have to worry about in a carpeted office indoor environment, but you can absolutely see those things plain as day, especially when you're dealing in complex environments.
Very cool. And I think this is another type of facility where making sure the antenna pattern is what you predicted is critical to performance. Because you got to add another patch antenna to the aisle for the coverage and everything else. So making sure that that antenna pattern is the design that you thought it would be.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Design is an artistic process where you teach people to go and you teach them how to paint a picture, the ECSE design course, for example, but you don't teach them what the colors are. You teach them the mechanics behind painting a picture. And then, as Stu said, you go into the field and you take those skills about how to design a network, and then you pick your antennas, you pick your color, you pick your palette, you pick your topic, and you go and you paint your picture. And you can dive off for a week on the differences in doing a survey in a warehouse. Do you do high gain directionals? Do you do spotlight coverage? Do you do omnis? Do you do backfills? Do you do just a million and one different types of ways to do a design? And this obviously is in a warehouse design session, but the complexities that come with people who are pitching, warehouse antennas that perform like this, and then guess what? You put them out in the field and they look nothing like the manufacturer expect them to do. That's hugely dangerous. And AP on a Stick is about mitigating risk, right? It's about making sure that those dangers that you're incurring don't come back to bite you in the rear.
All right, so warehousing, enterprise, you alluded to some of the enterprise AP on a Stick examples a few minutes ago. Share with us some of the enterprise examples you've been working in.
Oh, I thought Grant was going to take this one. No, Grant.
Grants are at the end.
No. Enterprise use cases are interesting because they're sort of considered the ho-hum of the design, right? They're considered the carpeted office, indoor, everybody can do them. They're the easy ones, so to speak. And I would say that the interesting thing about designs that are quote unquote easy is they have higher level of expectations. You go into a warehouse and they're going to say, I need to connect my forklifts, and if they stop, my business is going to come to a screeching halt. That's easy. You go to an enterprise where they're overlaying things like location-based services or analytics or guest portals or data about how that Wi-Fi network is being used or sensor connectivity. And each of those things adds a compounding amount of value to that infrastructure. And when something becomes incredibly valuable, the risk to getting it wrong skyrockets. While if you get something wrong in a warehouse, you may take a forklift out of service, and that's a very tangible dollar figure. But if you get something wrong in an enterprise where you have all of these various and sundry folks who are expecting this to work, from the CFO all the way on down to the dinks that walk in the front door who complain about everything on social media, right? How many black eyes can your organization take because somebody walked in and said, I can't get on the Wi-Fi, you know, forget this company that I was going to buy insurance from, go down to those folks down the street because their Wi-Fi works great, and when I have to sit and wait in the lobby, it's good. The calculatable impact to your business is dramatically different in your sort of traditional enterprise office space, depending on who's going to use that network for what. Getting it wrong could have cascading effects that we have no idea about.
So someone was asking the question, designing for density versus coverage. Does designing for density make an AP on a stick survey less important in an office environment? But I think it depends on the requirements of what your network is, right? So Sam, or actually we'll let Grant take that. What are your thoughts when designing for density versus coverage? Does that make AP on a stick surveys less important to perform?
Well, I was also just going to say with enterprise, I mean, and just, I know we're using a stock photo there, but I mean, that's a lot of open space and a lot of glass. And so, you know, enterprise office type environments, the last webinar we did that I was on for the autopilot survey, that was a big open office environment, and they were just using Omnis 80 wide channels everywhere. So you could probably guess what the main issues were in that type of scenario. So I think there is value still in doing that AP on a stick scenario, because you may be shying away from using Omnis and you might be looking to use, you know, some more external antenna type scenarios because you need to cover for density rather than just outright coverage. And when you've got those multiple services that are running off of that, and you've got multiple clients that are connecting to that, you know, like literally, you know, every customer that I talk to these days is BYD. Yes, absolutely. You know, that becomes a real consideration, and we need to think about that, and we need to plan that, you know, like just throwing, you know, a standard Omni access point at the design because it looks easy, it might be significantly different. So, you know, it does have its own challenges, just because it's a, you know, it's a pretty open floor plan. You know, we do still need to take into account some considerations there.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's talk about healthcare. Healthcare is its own ball of wax because there's requirements for infectious disease control. You know, you have to tent off the area if you have to, you know, a lot of that type of stuff. So Sam, talk to us about AP on a stick in healthcare environments.
Yeah, the healthcare one tends to be the chip shot of the groups, meaning that not only do you have these sort of cascading business requirements that get lumped in, you sort of have every single use case everywhere. I don't know of any healthcare organization today that's not tackling things like, we want convenience networks for our patients. We want to make our patients happy while they're here. And how do you make a patient happy while they're here? You go into a children's hospital, and the convenience network for their guests is just as important in the administration's eyes as the network for the life-saving equipment, because a happy patient is a patient who is in a better state of mind, who can generally recover better. And so you go into a children's hospital and you go, man, the guest Wi-Fi is down, which means that I have, you know, 1,000 kids with cancer that can't play on their Xbox to keep them distracted and keep them occupied and happy and engaged. That becomes a real issue where you go, my guest network for video games could impact a patient's life. It's one of those things where you have to look at the challenges in healthcare in a different way, because it's different than an EDU environment, or, you know, my boss wants to play Xbox on the big TV in the conference room. In addition to every single cascading other thing they want to put on the network, and that's sensor networks for you know, biomed samples in the fridge. It's RTLS for patient elopement. It's just one thing after another, after another. And in addition to the applications that sort of come onto the network, the fact that you may have to go into an area before you hang the AP, and you may have to close off a wing, right? You may have to literally take a dozen patient rooms out of service just to get cable into the ceiling. The costs to doing that, just from an outage perspective, they have to relocate patients, they have to relocate nurses, they have to relocate patient care equipment. They have to pull all that stuff to another wing of the hospital, potentially overload an area of the hospital, just so that you can have a team open up the ceiling and run cables to a place where you went, yeah, that seems like a good spot for an AP. You want to see a grumpy administration go, man, I got that one wrong. You're going to need to close this whole place down and then move it 30 feet that way. That gets real challenging real quickly.
Yeah, that's easy stuff. So before we move on to talking about, because we've got 2 more examples left, and Grant's going to highlight some of those. A lot of folks have been asking about LPV, stadiums, arenas. So how, obviously, when you're deploying and you're doing your design, the arena is probably not going to be full, right? So what do you use to simulate the client load and the capacity as you're doing your survey to be able to account for that? Sam, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, people. Yeah. I think there's no better way to gain empirical evidence other than to make the environment look like you expect it to look like when it's going to be working. Now that presents a tremendous amount of challenges. We're talking about layer 1, layer 2 measurement of beacons, and so okay, do you really need a full arena to measure that? No, but if you come up with a design that says, you know, we're going to put APs underneath seats in the venue, and we're going to see how many seats we can cover at a relatively low power level so that we can get density required. Get people and walk an aisle and let those people filter in behind you in the aisle. Walk in the next aisle, let the next group of people filter in behind you. Have a free pizza day and invite people in. We just need you. Can I say we just need you for your body? I guess I can, right? We can tell people we need them to measure their impact on the Wi-Fi network. And then literally take an AP, put it under the seat where you expect it to do, and get 30 or 40 or 50 people in and measure the impact of those bodies. You can predict and you can get reasonably close, but I would say before you go and start core drilling and the like, you probably want to take the time, energy, and effort to go and measure. We did an LPV here locally where we literally temporarily mounted an AP under a seat, and then 5 minutes before a concert started, they let me in because they knew the section was going to be populated. And I literally walked up and down the row of patrons that were getting ready to watch a concert. And it was, excuse me, hang on, excuse me, coming through. And I literally just scooched right on down the aisle. I did 10 aisles worth and got a tremendous amount of data about what that one AP is going to look like.
Yeah, that's really important.
Technically an AP on a stick, even though it's an AP on the ground.
Yeah, I've done that myself. Those bags of mostly water, right? I mean, wasn't that a Star Trek reference from season 1, episode 18 of Holmes? Yeah, something like that. I can't remember. Anyways, someone can check that reference. And his bags of mostly water, because you'd be amazed what the difference is in your performance when you have more people.
Absolutely. So
Yeah,
Sam,
no doubt.
Question, because this particular LPV that I'm thinking about, they have AP staged under seats, and then they also had some high gain antennas up in the catwalk areas. So when you're, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're doing a survey in those facilities, you've got to make sure that you have their facility people that are allowing you access to those areas. You have your company representative with you so that you can make sure that it's where you want it placed. There's a number of other things that account into there because, different experience, people play stuff before and after, the environments change so quickly and those type of things for adjustment. So you just need to make sure that if you are putting something in the catwalk area above there, that you have the access that you need during that off time.
Yeah, no doubt about it. That's everything from facilities people to installers to company representative. If you're going to be up in the catwalks saying, I want you to point this at this seat down there on the ground, you need to be able to coordinate with that person and trust them, because you may not have an employee who's certified to go up and be in the catwalks, especially at the start of a venue. Man, you go into a concert and the traveling show that comes along with them for the riggers and everything, they may not allow you in the catwalks to go and place the assets where you need them to go in order to get into that venue at install time to measure them where it is they're going to be in person.
Yeah. All right, so we're, in an effort to make sure we get to everything, there's AP on a stick. I mean, I think once again, another webinar we need to follow up to, right? There's so much information. So Grant, you've done a lot of surveys in government type buildings, facilities. So why don't you share with us a little about the experience that you've had there and some of the tips that you have for us in surveying, government locations. Super secret.
Yeah. Yeah, super secret. Well, I mean, look, for government, let's not let the stock photos fool us. I mean, we have a myriad of environments with government, and so you know, they have different facilities. You know, some of them are like more of the industrial type. So you know, similar to like in the warehousing type environments where you know you've got a lot of metal, you know, desalination plants, sewage treatment plants, things like that that are both indoor and outdoor. You know, workspaces that are using lots of metal and corrugated iron and things like that, lots of brick. So really challenging environments. And then you go all the way to, you know, like just open plan office types. So you get this, you get this really big variety of environments. And so it's almost like a lot of what Sam sort of covered. You know, you've got the enterprise type, you know, for, you know, where the office workers or the white collar workers are going to be. And then you've got the blue collar type stuff, which is probably a lot more similar to like the warehousing type. So when you've got those type of challenges, you know, your AP on a stick kit is probably going to expand considerably because you've got a lot more variety that you've got to tackle. And in the couple of examples that I've had, it's been like, you know, local government saying, we want you to do an AP on a stick survey for all of our facilities. And so that's you know, it'll go from an office and then the next day you're at the sewage treatment plant, and then you're at, you know, you're back into an office type environment, into like an outdoor, you know, semi-stadium type thing that they've got, all types of different, you know, variety of environments there. So, you know, can I just say, let's just summarize everything that Sam said and say that's what we need for government? Is that it?
Well, you know,
can I play that card?
well,
especially in government, those big warehouse buildings where they store the Ark of the Covenant, right? Those are really, really complex RF environments where they have top men working on projects, right?
That's
really,
right.
Really
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why
Top
I can't
people.
talk too much about it. I cannot talk too much.
Ditto.
I thought that reference was going to come in with the historical buildings, but I mean, this probably goes back to one of the questions that we were sort of talking about before, around trying to understand what you know, what the wall types can be. And there was a like a heritage listed building or a historical building that I had to do a number of years ago. You know, it was they were doing a refurb effectively, and so we just had no idea what was in the walls themselves, and so we were getting a myriad of different you know, attenuation levels for the different walls that we were having. You know, and even things as simple as like glass windows. I mean, you know, windows that are considerably old. You know, they've got like, you know, lead lining around the windows and things like that. Things that you would not encounter in a modern building. And so you've really sort of got to check your expectations, and, you know, and everything needs to get measured. That's definitely not one of those ones where you can, you know, make an assumption that, well, you know, this wing of the building seems okay, so I can probably just replicate that, you know, mirror image it on the other side of the building. The whole thing needs to be done. So, you know, so that can be particularly tricky.
For those of us who got to go to WLPC, Kristen.
I was just going to say that. Yeah.
Talked about, so Kristen talked about some amazing. She works for a university in Norway, and some of these buildings that she was working on, hundreds and hundreds of years old. I mean, I can't imagine the challenge maintaining the historical building. You can't make any alterations, so that presents a lot of challenges.
Well, I think one of the things that she highlighted on that was definitely, yeah, you're right. Is that historical, and it's it's a place where it's they have to adapt to. They've renovated. They'll change it another way, but there's certain aspects of it that must remain the same. Where there's, I think the best reference was, we have a building that is probably older than you know, than the United States, America, right? That was a good one. That really put things into perspective right away. So, and I know that that was a really enlightening presentation on that, especially on historical. And I want to know more about that, because I think that's we're running into things of where you're finding you know, into older turn of the century buildings that are completely stone. And I mean, you can imagine what the Wi-Fi is like in Windsor Castle. I would really like to know. Maybe
I guess it's about the aesthetics, right? Like, so, you know, in those scenarios, it's like, well, this would be the best place to put the access point, and sorry, you cannot put it there.
Yeah,
You know,
they don't want you drilling. Like you just
Yeah.
cannot drill into the wall, right? It
Yeah.
is protecting
Well,
the wall.
yeah,
And so sometimes AP on a stick is used where we talk about AP on a stick in the context of validating that your coverage is going to get where it needs to go. If you're in a historic building like this and they go, no, 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 you can only use that location, wouldn't it be great to know where your coverage isn't going to go ahead of time?
Yeah.
Well, then take and stage the AP where they think you should go and then go, cool, man, here's going to be where your coverage gaps are. You're good with that, right? Right. So AP on a stick can be used two different ways, no doubt about it.
Maybe we bring Kristen on and talk about some of the AP on a stick surveys that they did in the underwater facility, wasn't it? You know, they had an underwater facility. Some of that
Sea
stuff.
Lab.
Planet pools, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're getting close to the end here, folks, but I wanted to make sure we had some time. So we're going to talk about some tips and some things that you can do when performing surveys. So Sam, I'm going to let you kick that off. Tips and lessons.
Yeah, determine if it's worth your time and effort. Obviously, I think we touched on that a little bit ago, which is AP on a stick work can be cumbersome. I mean, the most folks estimate, you know, in around about an hour or so to go do an AP on a stick, and that can be sliced and diced any number of ways. 45 minutes for walking, 15 minutes for documentation, whatever. If you start off with assuming that you're at about an hour per AP and you're doing 40 APs, guess what? It's about a week's worth of work. You really want to make sure that the time and energy you invest in doing it is worthwhile. And then there are a couple of things you can do to make things go faster. One is, you know, we obviously are an Ekahau customer. We use Sidekicks. The Sidekicks are fantastic tools, but make sure that if you're doing an AP on a stick that you have your Sidekick locked to the channel that the APs are on. And the two radios in the AP, the two radios in the Sidekick, if you lock them together, then those radios just scan those channels all the time, which means that you're not having to chase and hop different channels before you come back to your survey AP. You can gather a tremendous amount of data very, very quickly, and then that means that you can move reasonably quickly throughout your environment. The one that I like, though, at the end is that we all know AP on a stick is cumbersome. Don't feel like you have to limit yourself to one AP per person. We have several instances where we have people who have a high degree of confidence in their predictive ability, and they go, I'm pretty confident that these 40 APs are going to be on these locations. And at this point, I'm just sort of dotting my I's and crossing my T's to make sure I have that insurance for the person that needs the deployment. Well, don't take one AP and stage it. Take 2 or 3 or 4 APs and stage them in their locations, and then walk the walk path once for those 4 APs. If your design looks good, freeze those 4 APs, and you've done 4 APs in the time it may have taken you to do 2 APs. Now, yes, it requires more effort up front. It requires more equipment, more planning, more. But when you get into the actual step click work, there are some ways that you can achieve some efficiency so that you're not just doing a one-to-one every single time you're out doing an AP on a stick.
Grant, did Sam cover everything, or is there some stuff Sam forgot?
It's been briefly mentioned, but I'm a big fan of having at least a second person to help with the AP on a stick. A lot of the stuff that I've done has been the telescopic tripod type approach. And so, you know, you've either got a walkie-talkie or you've got a phone call going. And once you get to that cell edge and you're ready to move it to the next position, you know, hey, ready to go, and then they can just go and move it. And then you can already be in position to, you know, to do your survey, to get the overlap coverage that you're looking for. That can really speed up the process. But of course, you know, like we were talking about very early on in the piece, it's all about that cost scenario as well, right? So, you know, cost and time, you know, that has to get factored in as well.
A lot of folks are asking.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, a lot of folks are asking about. I'm taking the time, Sam. Yeah, are asking about tripods and where you can get them, what to use. A lot of people like to make their own, but folks like at the Wi-Fi stand, they do a great job putting together kits. There's a lot of that type of stuff available out there. Just search on Twitter or search on Google, and lots of kits that are available for use.
Yeah, and I'd like to say there's actually been some great audience participation in the Q&A actually today, which is amazing.
Really awesome.
There's the community is actually really reposting, you know, links to batteries. Thank you very much, Keith, on the battery options.
Yeah.
Also the stands and different you know, ways of doing things, which is really amazing. And I want to give a hats off to to the audience today for chiming in on even answering some questions, which is even amazing, getting in there. So this is really cool. Thank you very much, folks. One tip I'd like to just kind of add in there, and if I could, I know that maybe I'll get a couple seconds, is Grant mentioned, having someone else being there, kind of, helping you set it up or watching the poll. Get yourself some small little cones or something like from the dollar store, something, a little like safety cones or something. Put them around your tripod, because sometimes you never know, somebody may not know that you're there, right? So
look, I was going to say that, we all sort of openly acknowledge that AP on a Sticks take more effort than just plopping an AP on a predictive design. Like we get it. It takes some time to go and empirically measure an AP. As you're measuring that AP, make sure you're taking that empirical measurement and you're feeding it back into your predictive design, so that when you finish your first AP and you go to do your second AP, if your first measured AP doesn't look like your first predicted AP, then the chances are your second AP is not going to look like your second predicted AP is not going to look like your second AP on a stick, or your third predicted is not going to look like your third AP on a stick. Take that measured data and put that back into your predictive design to make sure that your next one is going to get a lot closer to what you think it should look like predictively, so that when you do place that AP and walk around it, you're not wasting an hour. Nobody wants to place an AP on a stick and walk around it and go, oh, it's in the wrong location, pull it down, and then go spend another hour for that AP. Better do that than to go have to do a new cable run. That's why we go through that. But make sure that you're efficient. Gather that data, digest that data, and then put it back into your predictive design there when you're in the field, right? There when you're doing your AP on a stick. Run back through your predictive design and go, oh, this is good. I think that this matches, and I think that I have a high degree of confidence to move forward.
So with that, folks, we'll wrap up. Obviously not all environments are created equal, so we need to make sure that we're validating our designs, confirming the requirements of our networks are met. Grant, any last thoughts on surveys, AP on a stick surveys?
No, I was going to jump in with what Stu said about making your AP on a stick visible. I actually had a lady walk into my kit when it was in the library, because the access point was positioned in such a space that she wasn't expecting it was going to be there. So it didn't quite fall over, but after that point, I went down to the local hardware store and got high-vis tape, because the whole kit was black, right? So it blended in with the carpet. And I literally just wrapped the tape around the kit, so it was highly visible. But I've seen implementations with flashing LED lights. The cones is a great example as well. Make it visible, so because people may not be expecting that it's going to be there.
Because someone like me will undoubtedly trip over it.
or myself.
yeah, exactly. Sam, any last thoughts?
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's about risk mitigation. If you don't need to worry about social media black eyes, you don't need to worry about CFOs or CTOs or CEOs who are going to complain because the Wi-Fi coverage isn't good. If you don't need to complain, if you don't need to worry about applications that aren't going to be performing well, if you don't need to worry about those things, maybe don't waste the time. But there's a whole spectrum of concern that you as the designer are incurring the risk for this project for. And it's ultimately your name that's on the line. It's you, the person who is doing the design, is the one that's responsible for, is this thing going to go or not? And I tend to be a reasonably conservative person when it comes to making commitments. And so I want to make sure that I want to go measure. Not everybody does that. Not everybody needs to do that. Not every environment is the same or has those sort of stringent requirements. Put some thought into consciously balancing the risk of doing an AP on a stick or not doing an AP on a stick. And write that down somewhere and say, hey, I could have validated this, I could have empirically measured this, but I chose the effort was not worth it. And then hope that doesn't come back to bite you in the rear.
Stu, any last thoughts?
I think there's empirical data. It always matters, and that is your and using collected data is the source of truth, and so understanding what that data that you're getting in there, and as Sam says, digesting that data is always key of knowing your environment. It's make sure that there's no garbage in or garbage out. Make sure you've got the truth data in and out. So that'll help you on your design, and also safety, right? So make sure that you've got all your safety kit, and that could be another webinar as a safety. Yes.
Yeah, yes, I need to take that class and will participate in that webinar. So folks, again, want to thank Sam for participating, and of course our fearless sales engineers, Grant and Stu. Thank you for taking the time, especially Grant, because it's really early in the morning. So we
I
have
have to remind people of that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tony, as well. Thank you.
If you
Thanks,
have any
Sam.
questions, for Sam, for Grant, for Stu, and myself, please feel free to reach out. The information is there. I know that everybody's willing to field and answer questions. Once again, thank you for all the great, fantastic questions and the audience participation in that, because we do do our best to try to get all of the question answers answered. Sometimes it's a challenge, but thank you. And with that, folks, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Good night, Grant.
Good evening.
Sweet dreams.